Good morning, everybody. How are things? Good? All right. So today I had you read sort of half a chapter. I have a colleague writing a new history textbook on modern Japan. I hope that will be better than this one in terms of putting things together. I find that the end of the Meiji period and the early Taisho period is a really complicated time. And that as I was trying to put the lecture together, I tried to find a new way to organize the events. So what I'm thinking of is that we're talking about a period of contradictions and sort of very stark sort of black and white contrast. And so I want to use that framework to talk about the end of the Meiji period in politics, what's happening. So let's see if this sort of new framework will function today. The first kind of contrast is between that of victory and disappointment. Japan goes into the 1890s with a lot of positive, sort of, I think, positive, forward imperialistic momentum. And if you'll recall, we talked last class about how they won the war against China. This is a huge deal, right? Big China, little Japan. This victory brings to Japan a large amount of cash, hundreds of millions of dollars, if we're counting in dollars. It also gives them officially Taiwan as a colony, right? And they also have control of the peninsula, the other peninsula, which is here, in this part here. So, sorry, that's not right, up there. So this is a big deal. And they get to also have 4 ports open to Japanese trade in China, where they can officially have their own extraterritorial settlements in China. So this is a big deal, right? This is a positive thing for Japan economically and politically as well, in terms of the global trade system as well. It's a big deal. But right afterwards, before they've even let the ink dry on this treaty that ends this war, the West intervenes. Have you guys read about this a little bit? There's a term for this sort of about face the West does after the Sino-Japanese War. Is there a term that you guys can think about that you recall that refers to this about face, this change? The second part is intervention. Does that ring a bell? Okay, this is the triple intervention. So Japan defeats China and has these new territories, and the West is very concerned about this, right? And not one, but all the countries in the West are all of a sudden disapproving of Japan's victory. They're worried it's going to go too far. So they meet together, in Germany in particular, and they discuss how to kind of hold Japan back. And then they announced to Japan that they would like to advise Japan to return parts of what they've received to Western powers. So in particular, the Liaodong Peninsula and the major port city, Port Arthur or Dalian, are remanded to Russia, and Shandong Peninsula gets returned back to Germany and Britain in part. So the two sort of treaty ports in that area go to Weihai and Qingdao, are returned to these Western powers. Japan goes along with this because they still want to be able to be at the big table with the Western powers. But I mean, how would you feel, right, if you just won a victory and you have followed this Western model and you've won these gains and then they're taken away from you? You feel pretty bad. You feel pretty angry. So anyway, Japan goes along with this. One important repercussion of this is that Russia is able to begin to expand in Manchuria. One of the things that had worried Japan in the first place begins to happen because of this triple intervention. Russia lays down tracks for the South Manchurian railway, which is going to connect, hopefully, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and allow access to the warm water port in Vladivostok to go all the way to perhaps even to Moscow. Johnny.
Would Japan still able to trade with China and just didn't have control?
Yeah. There's still a trade. There's actually an open door policy applied to China in 899, which makes trade for all countries. Hopefully everyone will be able to trade, or so the U.S. would like to argue. But yes, trade is definitely still able to happen. The Russians also fortified Port Arthur, making it a military base as opposed to a trade post or a settlement. And they're also meddling in Korea, trying to give money, advice, weapons to anti-Japanese Koreans in the government. So they're not playing by the rules. And Japan is more or less aware of this. There are several Japan-Russia treaties that are signed, hoping to push Russia to obey the rules, but they don't. The Boxer Rebellion, this is a big topic. We can't today go into that in much detail, but essentially a large part of the population, mostly men, unemployed, frustrated, confused looking, and also a number of natural disasters and crop failures push these men between the ages of about 15 and 40 to question their government and to question what's making China so weak. And they find that the answer is, in part, the influence of the West. They do what's called spirit boxing, involving going into trances and practicing martial arts. And these clubs grow, and then, as you might imagine, right, these fight clubs grow into a mass movement that tries to overthrow the government, attacking particular Western settlements in Tianjin and in Shanghai and Northeast China as well. Lauren, yes. Yeah, this is China. So, good question. So this is happening in China. A long story short, the West, frustrated and also worried about their residents in China, send troops to put down the Boxers, the Empress of China, the last sort of Qing Empress of China. So I guess she's the Empress Dowager officially. She sides with the Boxers, and her own troops help the Boxers to fight against the West. So it becomes a war between the Western countries that are in China and China. The outcome, as you might imagine, spirit Boxers are not, as they believe, immune to bullets, and they are defeated. Their numbers are not enough, and the West wins this. The result is the Boxer Protocol, which leaves all these countries with quite a few financial benefits, as you might imagine. So, the Dutch and the Germans and the French and the Italians, everyone gets a piece of this. And this is kind of the last sort of stab in the coffin. This is what leads to the sort of the end of Imperial China. China's court officials and generals, some of them are executed. This is not really that important today, but there is a ban on importing arms into China for 2 years, so they can't modernize their military at all. The exam system, which is how they choose the civil bureaucracy, is outlawed for 5 years, which cripples, in fact, indefinitely the Chinese government. Bigger legation for foreign settlement in Beijing is mandated, and a very, very big indemnity over the course of 40 years. All that's all very big. For Japan, what's important is that Russia agrees to move its troops, its military, out of Manchuria, and this is what they hope that will lead to Russian, at least, neutrality in Manchuria and allow Japan to continue their own expansion in Manchuria. By 1902, other countries even in the West, are worried about Russia not playing by the rules. Yeah, I see your hand. Derek, yeah.
So was this like the first time that Japan was like engaged with Europe? Or like the first time it did became like a part of, I guess Could you present like the modern like powers?
Yeah, right. Japan has become one of the great powers, or so they feel. Yeah, and this part of how this is demonstrated is the signing of the Japanese British alliance, the Anglo-Japanese alliance, 1902. Antonio.
The Boxer Revolution. When you said the U.S., which were the actual countries that sent troops to fight them?
There were 7 countries, so.
Was it all of the ones that signed it?
There were Russian troops, there were British troops. Yeah, I think all the countries had some either troops or they had people who were in danger or harmed during the uprising. But only 7 of these: Russia, Germany, the UK, France, Belgium, Japan, and one more country actually had troops. They sent. Yeah, Johnny. Yeah, Japan sent troops, and they were actually one of the larger contingents, which is why they felt that they were owed Russia's agreement to move their troops from Manchuria. Good question. Yeah.
It's kind of weird to see Austria-Hungary included in the treaty. Is that just because they were a great power and they threw them in, or?
Well, there was an Austro-Hungarian legation or treaty port in Tianjin.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. Ross, right? Yeah. Nice questions, guys. So, in fear of Russia's non-compliance with the Boxer Protocol, Japan and the British create an alliance. And this is, as you said, Dick, this is a big deal, right? This is the first time that we have this West-non-West alliance as equals. They agree that Japan has a special interest in Korea, so it's sort of their project. They agree that both Korea and Japan are interested in China and have a tie to China. Most importantly, though, they agree that if in East Asia a war against either the British or the Japanese breaks out against one enemy, that the British won't intervene against Japan, and that Japan won't intervene to assist or fight against the British. And if 2 powers ever attack Japan or the British, other will assist, right? So this is, again, a very big commitment. Peter, right? I think you're right. I think this is a mistake. Yeah, I think this is you're right. So this should be Great Britain here. Thanks, Peter. Yes, that's what that should be. So they both hope that China will stay open, right, enough for them each to extract their own wealth and develop their own sort of imperial ambitions in China. The Russian troops are not moved from Manchuria. Russian fortifications continue to grow. The railroad continues to grow. The evidence of Russian meddling in Korea is impossible to ignore. So the Japanese decide to a pretty risky move to call them on it. And when the Russians don't back down, they attack. And there is a surprise attack after already declaring war on a Russian fleet near Port Arthur, which is here. And this is a battle fought by land and by sea. It's a war of attrition. It's not a very nice war with tidy battles or a clear winner. The Russians they attempt to disable Japanese warships, but are not able to do so. In the end, the Japanese naval power is far superior to the Russian naval power, and they are victorious. But on land, there's a stalemate. The Russians and the Japanese are not. Neither one is victorious. historians see a small advantage to the Japanese, but not enough to have won this war on land. The Russian army eventually surrenders in some places, but the real surrender happens through mediation, right, of an external force. Yeah, Johnny.
Did the British get involved in this?
No, this
Because it was one country.
this one country. Yeah, this was just a Japanese war.
If the British went to war against multiple countries, but like they started it, but the Japanese still have to.
Yep. Yeah, good question. Lauren?
What caused this?
This war was caused by the Russian failure to respect the Boxer Protocol, which would have required them to remove their troops, the military force from Manchuria, and to recognize Japanese rights to have business and to have an economic interest in Manchuria.
So there's been
Yeah, and they also were doing things to try and destabilize Korea, which was Japan's, at this point, unofficial protectorate. All right, Antonio?
Where is Manchuria?
Manchuria is it's the northeast 6 provinces of China, so it's the part that sticks out and touches Korea, and also touches Russia, and yeah, that's where Manchuria is. Good question. The Russo-Japanese War comes to a conclusion. There's a lot of imagery that shows, in the Western press as well, a victorious Japan. But the real victory happens through the Treaty of Portsmouth, moderated by Teddy Roosevelt in New Hampshire, between the Russians and the Japanese. If China was a big deal, and being China was a big deal, being Russia was an even bigger deal, the Western press was very much impressed, right, by Japan's, as an Eastern nation, a yellow nation beating a white nation, a European nation in their eyes, and a much bigger nation as well, like China. This victory was impressive, and the result of the treaty is that for once and for all, Russia recognizes Japan's supremacy in Korea. They won't meddle anymore in Korea. They won't try and destabilize Korea. They won't try and convince the politicians to form parties against Japan. Russian holdings. This is probably the biggest point in terms of the Boxer Protocol. They give it all away to the Japanese. So they're building a railroad. And this will actually become the lifeline of Japan's empire on the continent, because Japan will take over this railroad, the South Manchurian Railroad. And this will open the door for Japanese expansion into Manchuria and to Korea indefinitely. They also get the southern half of Sakhalin Island, which is an island in the far north of Hokkaido. Half of that goes to Japan, half goes to Russia. And however, there is no agreement upon an indemnity. So this war was a war that had a lot of casualties, more than the Sino-Japanese War. It was also a bit longer. But the press by this point had become so good at sort of selling victory, right, and at promising the suffering and sacrifice would lead to, like the last war, an economic windfall for Japan. This doesn't happen. So the people of Japan, for the first time ever, come together the day after this is announced to begin to question the government, what they're doing. The Abiya riot that breaks out, there's no date on this, which there should be. I think it happens in September. So a few weeks after this is announced, right? They officially come together. The Abiya riot is a very big riot. Abiya is a park. It's a new city park that was created just outside the Imperial Palace, where the emperor lives. Demonstrators gather there, probably around 10,000, and the police show up to try and contain this. Had this been anywhere else in Tokyo, no one would have cared, perhaps. But they chose this this location because of its proximity to the Imperial Palace, because of its visibility. And then this spreads throughout the country. So over the next week or so, almost all of Japan's prefectures are having some sort of violence. They're protesting the government's willingness to accept a treaty that doesn't favor Japan. And they're protesting also the sacrifices that their families were making by sending troops to die without getting anything in return. The number of deaths is probably underestimated, but at least 17 people were confirmed to have died at the Via riot itself. This was a popular uprising. We hadn't really seen this, since the peasant class was sort of trying to rebel in the 1800s. We hadn't seen popular uprisings like this with people fighting and trying to have political involvement. So this is a big deal, and this sort of inaugurates about a 15-year period of popular protest, right, in the streets that comes to characterize the end of the Meiji period and the early Taisho period, the following period. So this is a map of part of Tokyo. All of this here is the Imperial Palace, and this is all the moat here, so the moat is here, and this is also walls here, and Hibiya Park is here. So it really is right next to the Imperial Palace, right? The emperor could look out, in fact, he could see this, what was happening, if he chose to. Not everyone was protesting. I found a picture of some folks just fishing during the protest. But they're fishing in the imperial moat, which is very much prohibited, and very illegal, and very punishable. So, why would you go do that? If you were, a Tokyo resident, why would you go fish in the imperial moat instead of, protesting? What's the point? Is it Andrew? Yeah.
Kind of like a more subtle slap in the face for the government.
It's more subtle?
Yeah.
So why be subtle?
Because I feel like then it's more of a slap too, so it's kind of a stronger way to protest rather than act with violence. It's like stronger to, I guess, just like be quiet and calm your face and go to the
Yeah, so there's a very subversive element to this, right? Beyond taking it to the face of the emperor and to the police force, you don't have to be doing those kinds of things to show that you don't believe in and you don't buy into what's being sold, that you don't agree with the policies or the government's actions. So I think there are many more of these sort of subtle acts that are happening throughout Japan that the numbers we have about the protests don't really accurately portray. So the country as a whole, I think, was pretty pissed off. To make things worse, and we're thinking about victory and frustration, right? Victory, Japan has won this war, not enough in return on their investment, their sacrifice, but they are at the big table, right, among the great powers, and they believe that they belong there. But in 1907, they get another indication that they are not, in fact, welcome there. 1907 is the year that the Prime Minister, Sanuji Kimochi, and President Roosevelt signed. It's an agreement between gentlemen. It's not an official document with any sort of legal weight, but it does essentially promise the U.S. will not limit Japanese immigration if Japan will stop immigration to the United States. And this all grows out of a larger sense of racism and economic nationalism happening in California. In particular, there is as this sign here indicates, sort of ethnic violence that's happening, as well as just general general against the Japanese that is based on a fear that the Japanese are taking all the good jobs. Does that sound familiar? Right. So this ideology, right? The Japanese at this point are coming to Japan in large numbers, but they're not actually that many. They're probably less than 1 million in the United States, all the United States. But they are being painted as these invaders who are taking over all the good jobs, and they're building the railroads. They are working in the factories in California, doing the sort of canning fish, these kinds of things. And there is a genuine worry about them taking over jobs. So this agreement, which the U.S. doesn't have with any Western country, there's no immigration against other countries, no immigration laws against other countries. Immigration to Japan, to the U.S., but this is a sign for the Japanese that they're not, in fact, welcome. And they're not fully at the table yet. So we always have this back and forth. I want to talk next about politics, an area where we have, again, we have very sort of contrasting, contradictory situations. So on the one hand, we have democracy, right? And on the other hand, we have oligarchy. And by the end, we'll also have democracy and also a military oligarchy. So I want to talk about how these two very different ways of governing are at the same time present and how they come into power. Antonio?
I just have a side note question. Did the big countries like the UK and the US who made agreements with Japan actually consider them a large power, or did they think they could kind of make the Japanese do whatever they wanted because they really wanted to?
That's really hard to answer. I think that there is. Teddy Roosevelt had a Japanese judo teacher competition, judo. So there is a fascination with the Japanese. There is an interest in what they bring to the West, right? There is some respect, right? And partially, I think that the missionaries and foreign experts in Japan are bringing back reports of a highly civilized country. So I think that there is that. But I think that you're not wrong in seeing that there perhaps is a question of manipulation of possibility for Westerners to use Japan for their own ends that increasingly Japan is unwilling to accept. Yeah. Ross?
I noticed in the last picture there were electrical lines. When did electricity arrive to Japanese city?
A book on that just came out or is coming out. I think it comes. Electricity in Japan begins to come in the 1870s and 1880s. It's a bit slow to spread throughout Japan. The capital is the first, so they have it in the 1860s, and the new Ginza neighborhood with the Western brick buildings built in 1870s. That neighborhood has electricity first. So by 1880, though, I think we see electricity throughout most of urban Japan. Yeah, Johnny?
Was the U.S. the only country that had strongest religion?
I think so. I think that the U.S. was by and far the country with the most explicit limits on immigration from Japan. Yeah. Good questions. So democracy, oligarchy, military oligarchy, these are very different things. So how do they coexist? And this is where I find the book to be a little bit frustrating, so I'm going to try and make sense of this. So the Constitution lays out that Japan will have a cabinet with Prime Minister, Minister of the Army, Minister of the Navy, of Education, etc. And they will have an imperial diet with 2 houses. But it also has other things, like the Privy Council and the Council of Elder Statesmen, which will actually go away, but the men called the Ginro or will still be around. So I want to talk about these different pieces. Let's talk first of all about who's in charge in Japan. Who are the prime ministers of Japan, I should say. these are the prime ministers of Japan from 1885 until 1911. What strikes you about this list? I'll go back, yeah. Cash? There's a lot of them. Okay. What else? Noah? Yeah, they're the same people, right? So these are the same samurai from Choshu, in particular, Choshu domain, who were involved in the Meiji Restoration. They are prime minister over and over again, right? If we count, I think 4 times Iterumi is prime minister. Who else is important? The other most common prime minister was Yamagata Aritomo, who's prime minister several times as well. And those who come afterwards are their proteges. So we have a very small number, a pool of prime ministers here. Derek. Every time that the imperial diet shifts, like if people are elected and they choose, or if you have a big crisis, they choose or they ask prime minister to step down and they choose a new person. So that's why that happens. So let's go back here. All right, so that's one thing that's happening, right? So we have elected people in the diet. We have the same people, more or less, the same small clique of oligarchs running the country as prime minister. Let's talk about the Privy Council. The Privy Council is a group initially of 12 men. It grows to 24 by the end of the imperial era, 1945. These 12 men are chosen by the emperor to advise the emperor, and they have an extremely important role. They're appointed for life. They meet with the emperor, or sometimes among themselves, but in secret, in the imperial palace. And some say that they're the most powerful men in Japan. I always say that in the Meiji period, they have the most power. They have the emperor's ear. They make choices that are very important for Japan with the emperor. By the 1910s, the democratic side has taken precedent. So they can propose sometimes they propose amendments. They can talk about constitutional interpretation. They can proclaim martial law, or declaration of war, of course through the emperor. Talk about succession, these kinds of things. So they're the counselors, the advisors of the emperor. And the emperor also has Ginro, or these are elder statesmen, who he individually, right, asks to be informal advisors. And they're also very important, right? These are the figures he asks about state policy, about what to do in various situations. These are the founding fathers of Japan, some of whom are also prime ministers, including Yamagata Aritomo and Ito Hirobumi. There are only 8 of them, right, of these elder statesmen, and seven of them are of this Choshu Satsuma clique that were the people who founded the new government. These are also the men who more or less tell the emperor who the prime minister should be. So the imperial diet, they might have no confidence, but they would like to get a message to the Ginro that the emperor should change the prime minister, and that's why we have this turnaround happening. So very powerful men who are not in fact elected are very influential in Japan. So we talk about the Meiji oligarchs a lot, and that's because the system is very much also at the same time an oligarchy. But there is an imperial diet, and so we're seeing a swing of the pendulum towards more democracy. So let's talk about that a little bit. There's the upper house, and these are people who have imperially granted titles of nobility or aristocracy. Some were former daimyo, some were leaders in business, industry, some were journalists and these kinds of figures, activists. For the most part, though, they belong to the elite. Some are obviously are part of the families of the court. The other is the elected house, and the elections make this democratic. But if we look carefully, what that means, right? It took 15 yen of property people to vote in 1898 for the first election. 1889, sorry. And it was it was lowered to 10. So we see a drop, we see an increase from 1% population of men being able to vote to 2%. It's not a very large population voting. Like by comparison, in the United States, most of the country had white male suffrage by 1865, right? So this is a big difference we see in terms of democratic voice in Japan. Johnny?
Did the people of Japan know that there was only like 50 people running their country for like kind of like the same? Did they know?
They knew, yeah, and you see it back and forth. That you see some complacency, and then you see when things don't go right, you see frustration. But they were aware that this was still a very elite government, of which they were not necessarily a part. But they also, I think, see more and more chances to be part of the government, to be part of a larger democracy. And yeah, Lauren? So I showed you guys a chart a few weeks ago, and I think it shows it's really kind of a mess. So the actual political power of the Privy Council, they can't make laws, for example. They can't adjudicate on laws, but the emperor has the final say on sort of most executive order things, executive power roles, and so through him they're very, very influential. The Imperial Diet are the ones who discuss things like new laws. The factory law that they passed in the 1890s is a big deal. So they're making legislation. So that kind of, I think, partially answers your question. No, they can't make laws. They can't. All they can do has to occur through the emperor, who, if you'll recall, we'll be looking at the articles of the Constitution. Article 1, the emperor is, in the end, he can make war, right? He can make peace. He also has control over other important areas of government as well. He is the last person in charge. And also I should mention that there are also the birth of political parties. So politicians are relatively new, right, in the Meiji period, and we see them trying to gather popular support. Some of this comes out of the movement for people's rights in the 1880s. But these figures, some from the samurai class and some from the upper peasant classes, do get some influence. But again, these same figures are still the ones in charge. So the Liberal Party is its own party in the 1880s, and there's also a short-lived party that's called the Progressive Party in the 1890s. They merged into one liberal party in 1898. So that will be sort of that will be one party. A new party called Seiyukai is established in 1900, but it's established by Ito Hibumi, who is a Genro by this point, who has been a part of the Privy Council and who also was Prime Minister. So parties are still led by very elite figures. Damien? Well, so there are local branches of the different parties, and we do see more local participation in government through the local parties. But at the level of the country, the same figures leading are the ones that are heading the political parties. I want to talk lastly about the government efforts to control freedoms of expression. In 1875, the freedom of the press ordinance limits freedom of the press. In 1880, there's an ordinance on public meetings that prohibits meetings that are not ahead of time on politics, that they're not approved by the government. The biggest, perhaps, law is the Peace Police Law in 1900. This law prohibits any gathering or publication that will more or less disturb the peace, right? So these laws are vague, and they give the government a lot of leeway to make choices on who and how to on who to prosecute when an inflammatory article is published, or when a controversial political meeting is held. So all these measures are very effective, right? And only a very small number of people in Japan risk writing things against the government. And it will get a bit worse. I'll sort of talk about that more later on. But the roots of this system are laid in the Meiji period. At the same time, there are a few figures who are willing to be controversial, who are willing to take their ideologies to the extreme. I wanted to highlight a few here. In 1911, a plot was discovered among a group of anarcho-syndicalists in Japan. These are, among them was Kotoku Shisui, who was the leading anarchist in Japan, but he was a theoretical anarchist. He had never done anything to promote real anarchy. He was talking about, he was a writer, and he was part of a movement that talked about how cool it would be if the emperor died, right? How that would throw Japan into chaos and would give the country a chance to start again on a better foundation, a more democratic foundation, a more egalitarian foundation. And Kanosuga, a friend and colleague, was a socialist. She was part of this group as well. To make a long story short, this plot was discovered, and these figures were executed. And the execution was a big deal in Japan because, on the one hand, the trial was a sham. There was very little evidence of an actual plot or of any plan to carry out the plot. And in the plot, Kotoku Shisui was probably the one with the least ties to any actual, possible wrongdoing, aside from ideological wrongdoing. But this really creates a lot of fear among the left in Japan, and they go underground. After his death in New York, there was a big funeral procession to celebrate his life with thousands of people in the streets. So he was an international socialist, anarchist figure whose death what sort of was more important beyond Japan. But this, I think, shows not everyone in Japan was happy with where things were going, and so we do see that there are always these contrasts, right? The repression and the efforts to be free thinkers, controversial thinkers. We see a democracy with oligarchs who have all the power all the time, and we see a country that has worked hard to become as strong as Western powers, but always struggles to be seen as one. Johnny?
You said there was a funeral firm in New York that came to see.
Yeah.
So even though he was Japanese and the U.S. didn't accept Japanese people, they accepted him. So it was just more on the West Coast they didn't accept him.
Well, this was a funeral organized by Emma Goldman and a lot of figures who were socialists in the United States, not by the government. So, yeah, he had supporters among people in those various parties. Yeah. Okay, thanks. And I will see you all on Thursday. Have a good rest of your day.